Some of the greatest R&B albums ever made. Nobody heard them. The 70s were full of genius, but the music industry buried some of it on purpose. These weren't failed albums. They were flawless albums. Albums that got no radio play. No promotion, no chance. And the artists who made them, most of them never recovered. Here's the truth nobody talks about. The records that should have changed everything still can. If you think you know 70s R&B, this list will prove you wrong. Number 10, Willie Hutch. The album is called Fully Exposed. And the title says everything. Close your eyes for a second. It is 1973. You are in a city that is cracking at the edges. Money is tight, the streets are loud, and somebody put this record on. It doesn't ease you in gently. It grabs you by the collar from the first note. This is not dinner party music. This is music for people who have seen the real world and are not pretending otherwise. Everything we stood for. Willie Hutch was signed to Motown. And that name alone tells you he had serious talent, because Berry Gordy did not let just anybody through that door, but Fully Exposed was not the glossy, polished Motown sound most people expected. Willie pushed it somewhere darker. The production was raw and intentional. The arrangements had weight to them. The lyrics spoke directly about black life in America, about struggle, about dignity, about survival. He had already made a name for himself doing the soundtrack for the Mac earlier that same year, and that album had made people sit up and pay attention. But Fully Exposed was his real statement, his real self. The record was a cult favorite in soul circles. It never climbed the mainstream charts the way it deserved to, but the people who found it held on to it for life. Here's something most people don't know. Willie Hutch was not just a singer. He wrote for other artists. He arranged. He produced. The man was a full musician in every sense, but Motown had a way of boxing artists into a role, and Willie spent years trying to break out of the box they put him in. Fully Exposed was his attempt to show the world who he really was. The album got caught in Motown's complicated internal politics in the early 70s. The label was going through big changes, relocating from Detroit to Los Angeles, shifting its focus, chasing a new market. Willie Hutch was not a priority. The promotion wasn't there. The push wasn't there. And without the machine behind you at Motown, you could disappear overnight. That is exactly what happened here. The tragedy is that this album was too honest for its moment. The industry wanted something easier to sell. Willie gave them truth instead. Stay with us, because number 9 is a New Jersey soul record that hits even harder. Number 9, The Moments. Look at Me, released in 1975. And if you have never heard this album front to back, then you have been missing something real. The Moments were not from Detroit. They were not from Philadelphia. They were from New Jersey. And that matters because New Jersey soul had a different texture to it. Grittier, less polished, more human. Listening to Look at Me feels like sitting in someone's living room late at night. The lights are low, somebody is being honest. She's my girl. And the harmonies coming out of those three men are so warm you almost feel them in your chest. The Moments were signed to all platinum records, the label run by Sylvia Robinson, that same Sylvia Robinson who would later found Sugar Hill Records and bring hip-hop to the world through Rapper's Delight. The woman had a serious ear for talent. The group had already had a major hit with Love on a Two-Way Street back in 1970. But by 1975, the commercial spotlight had moved on. What Look at Me came out into a changing market. Disco was starting to rise. The radio stations were chasing a different sound. But the artistry on this album is undeniable. The arrangements are warm and intimate. The songwriting is emotional without being melodramatic. And the three-part harmonies are among the best you will ever hear in classic R&B. The Moments later became Ray Goodman and Brown when they left all platinum records. And they kept making beautiful music. But the fans who knew them as The Moments always said their early catalog had something the later work couldn't quite recapture. Look at Me as a big part of that argument. Poor distribution and a label that was stretching itself thin meant this album never got the national reach it needed. All Platinum was an independent operation, and independent labels in the mid-70s were fighting an uphill battle against the major label system. The album also came out at the wrong moment. Soft, warm, a harmony-driven R&B was starting to lose ground to the disco wave. The Moments were soulful and real, and that was exactly what the industry was moving away from. They deserved better. The music deserved better. Keep watching. Number 8 is a woman whose voice will stay in your head for the rest of your life.
Hey, Pop Lore family. Did you know only 1% of viewers are subscribed? If you love deep dives into pop legends, forgotten gems, and the stories behind the songs that shaped generations, hit that subscribe button right now. And don't forget to turn on LL notifications so you'll be the first to know when we premiere our next video. It's free, it helps Pop Lore grow, and it makes sure you never miss a single countdown or music story. Let's build this community together.
Number 8, Esther Phillips. The album is From a Whisper to a Scream.
Everything and tenderly.
And that title is not just poetry. It is a warning. There are singers. And then there are voices that feel like they carry the whole history of a people inside them. Esther Phillips was the second kind. When you hear this album, you feel it before you understand it. There is a weight to every single line she sings, a knowingness. A woman who has been through things she didn't ask for and came out the other side still standing, still singing.
The sky, I know this love.
This record came out on Kudu Records, a subsidiary of CTI, the jazz label run by Creed Taylor. Creed Taylor was a genius producer who understood that the line between jazz and soul was a thin one, and he blurred it deliberately. From a Whisper to a Scream sits right in that space. It is not a straight soul album. It has jazz chords underneath it, orchestral arrangements, a looseness in the rhythm that feels almost improvised.
Like I could never die.
But Esther Phillips wrote every bit of it with total control. The album was critically respected in small circles, but largely ignored by the mainstream R&B market, which wanted something more conventional. The jazz crossover audience was not big enough to give it the platform it needed. A version of a song on this album, What a Difference a Day Makes, became her biggest commercial hit 2 years later.
Bright are the stars that shine.
But the full album experience is something that single alone could never represent. Esther Phillips had started her career as a child, recording as Little Esther in the late 1940s. She had already survived more than most people face in a lifetime before she ever walked into the studio to make this record. The depth you hear in her voice is not performance, it is lived experience.
Love him.
Esther's personal battles with addiction were public, and the music industry used that against her for years. Instead of hearing the artistry, too many people focused on the struggle. The album was also caught between two audiences. It was too jazzy for the soul stations and too soulful for the jazz crowd. She deserved a massive platform. She got a cult following instead, and this album remains one of the most under-discussed masterworks of the entire decade. Don't go anywhere. Number 7 is a Detroit group that made an album so powerful it should have changed the entire sound of R&B. Number 7, The Dramatics, What You See Is What You Get. Detroit, 1972, and this record has never been given the credit it deserves. You have to understand what Detroit was in 1972. Motown had just left the city. The music industry had turned its back on the place that built it, but the musicians who stayed behind had something to prove. The Dramatics were those musicians. And this album sounds like proof. It sounds like 5 young men pouring everything they had into a record, knowing nobody was coming to save them, knowing they had to make something that would last on its own. The album was produced by Tony Hester and recorded at Stax adjacent studios for Volt Records. The Stax and Volt connection gave the music that Memphis-Detroit hybrid sound that was completely unique to this moment in time. Tony Hester's arrangements are some of the most underrated work in the entire history of soul music production. He understood tension. He understood how to build a song from the inside out, how to let the emotion build slowly and then release it at exactly the right moment. Ron Banks and William Howard traded lead vocals in a way that felt like a dialogue between 2 men working something out between themselves. Pride against vulnerability, strength against longing. It was cinematic. The title track was a legitimate hit, but the rest of the album never got the same attention, and that is where the real depth lives. Now, the Dramatics were nearly finished as a group before this album saved them. They had been through lineup changes, label confusion, and had almost lost their deal entirely. This album was their last shot, and they knew it. That kind of pressure either breaks an artist or produces a masterpiece. You already know which one happened here. Volt Records was in serious trouble by the early 70s after the death of Otis Redding and the financial collapse of the Stax empire. The infrastructure that should have pushed this album out to the world was crumbling in real time. And sugar, the Dramatics were brilliant artists working inside a machine that was falling apart around them. The album was also too sophisticated for easy radio play. It demanded attention, and in 1972, radio was not in the business of demanding anything from its listeners. Number 6 is a man who hip-hop built its foundation on, and most people still don't know his name. Number 6, Syl Johnson, Total Explosion, 1973.
You come, threatening me again, girl.
High Records, Memphis. If you know your hip-hop, you know his samples, but do you know the man? Total Explosion is the kind of album that hits you in the gut before it hits your ears. There is something physical about it. The bass sits low and heavy. The rhythm section moves like it is alive. And Syl Johnson, the man himself, sounds like someone who has been underestimated his whole life and is absolutely done pretending that doesn't bother him. There is fire in this record. Real fire.
Walk away and leave me. I ain't going.
Syl Johnson was on High Records in Memphis, the same label that housed Al Green at the height of his fame. Same studio, same producer, Willie Mitchell, same Memphis heat baked into every track, but while Al Green was the man whose name everyone knew, Syl Johnson was working right beside him, making records that were just as powerful, just as soulful, just as carefully crafted.
The best I can, but you don't see.
Total Explosion shows every bit of that. The production is thick and deliberate. And Willie Mitchell's signature style is all over it. That deep low-end groove, the precise but loose-feeling rhythm, the horns that cut through at exactly the right moment. Syl's voice is different from Al Green's. It is rougher, harder around the edges, more confrontational. Where Al made you feel tender, Syl made you feel something closer to righteous.
If you want to
Producers in the 90s sampled Syl Johnson so heavily that some of his records were sampled more than almost any other soul artist of the era. Wu-Tang, Common, Pete Rock, they all went back to the well. They understood what was in there. The irony is that the sampling made him well known in hip-hop circles, while the original albums remained largely forgotten by the mainstream soul audience.
wait a minute, you know each and every one's life, each and every one's
Al Green was simply too big. When you are on the same label as the biggest R&B star in the world, you are fighting for attention with one hand tied behind your back. No matter how good your music was, the promotion, the marketing, and the press coverage all went to Al. Syl Johnson made great records in the shadow of greatness, and history did not always pull the camera back far enough to show him standing there. We are halfway through this countdown, and number 5 is where things get really personal. A woman singing her heart out while a whole industry turned its back on her. Number 5, Ann Peebles, I Can't Stand the Rain, 1974.
Was so grand.
And this is the entry where we have to stop and talk about something important. The title track of this album is one of the greatest R&B singles ever recorded. You probably know it. You may have heard it 100 times. That descending drum beat, that low humming groove, that voice cutting right through the center of it. But here is what most people do not know.
Bringing back sweet memories.
The album built around that song is extraordinary. Every track on it holds up. Every single one, and it has been sitting in the shadows of a more famous man for over 50 years. Ann Peebles recorded I Can't Stand the Rain at High Records in Memphis, the same studio where Al Green was making his legendary run of albums. Willie Mitchell produced it with the same precision and care he gave to everything he touched. The production has that distinctive High Records sound. Warm, deep, controlled, but Ann Peebles brought something different to it. She sang with less ornamentation than Al Green, more direct, more confrontational, less decoration, more truth. The title track reached the top 5 on the R&B chart. It was covered by artists across multiple genres. It was licensed for films and television. It became one of the most recognizable songs of the entire decade, and still the album it came from was never given its proper place in the conversation. Now here's what we promised you earlier. Because this entry has a story behind it that goes beyond the music. In interviews over the years, people close to Ann Peebles have spoken about the reality of being a woman on a label that was built around a male star. Some have said the promotional resources were simply not equal. Some have described situations where her work was delayed or deprioritized to make room for Al Green's release schedule. There are different versions of how this all unfolded.
Just keeps on haunting me.
Willie Mitchell and Al Green have both spoken about their work in ways that honor Ann Peebles' talent. But the result, whatever the reasons behind it, was that Ann Peebles consistently received less promotional support, less press coverage, and less airtime than her male counterpart on the same label. This was not unique to High Records. It was a pattern that ran through the entire R&B industry in the 70s. Female artists were regularly outpaced in terms of resources, even when their music was just as strong. The music industry in that era had a way of deciding which stories it wanted to tell and which ones it wanted to bury. Ann Peebles made records that should have made her one of the defining voices of the decade. She was pushed to the margins instead. That is not a small thing. That is a deliberate structural injustice that robbed listeners of an artist at the height of her powers.
I can't stand her.
And the fact that we are sitting here now, 50 years later, you're still having to introduce people to this album is the proof. The music outlasted the machine that buried it. That is always how it ends. Beyond the internal label dynamics, Ann Peebles was also hurt by an era shift.
Everything was so great.
By the mid-70s, disco was eating the world. The deep, honest Memphis soul that defined her sound was being pushed off radio in real time. The saddest part is that she never stopped being great. She kept making music. But the window that had been barely open was now fully closed. Number 4 is an album that a genius made for the woman he loved, and the world almost missed it entirely. Number 4, Syreeta. The album is called Stevie Wonder Presents Syreeta. 1974, and yes, that is exactly who you think it is. Imagine the most gifted musician in the world writing an album specifically for the woman he loves, writing every song, producing every track, playing most of the instruments himself, and then stepping back and letting her voice lead. That is what this album is. It is intimate in a way that very few records ever are. Yes, it sounds like something private that you stumbled into by accident and didn't want to leave. Syreeta Wright had been a backup singer and songwriter at Motown before she married Stevie Wonder in 1970. Their marriage did not last, but before it ended, Stevie made this album with her, and it is one of the most lush, emotionally complete records in the Motown catalog. Stevie was at the peak of his creative powers in 1974. He had just released Inner Visions the year before. He was pushing boundaries in every direction. And on Syreeta's album, he brought all of that same creativity to bear in service of someone else's voice. The songwriting is complex but warm. The arrangements blend soul, gospel, jazz, and something harder to name, and Syreeta's voice moves through all of it with a confidence and vulnerability that makes the album feel deeply personal. The album received strong critical notices but weak commercial performance. Motown did not push it the way they should have, perhaps because the Stevie and Syreeta story had become complicated by the time of release. The album contains a song called Spinnin' and Spinnin' that was written by Stevie as a direct response to the emotional turbulence of their relationship ending. Stevie has spoken in interviews about how the creative process on this album was both joyful and heartbreaking at the same time. You can hear both of those things in every note. The Motown was in transition. The label was moving its operation from Detroit to Los Angeles, and in that process, a lot of worthy projects got lost in the shuffle. Syreeta's album was one of the casualties. There is also the shadow effect. Stevie Wonder's own albums from this era, Inner Visions, Fulfillingness's first finale, Songs in the Key of Life, were so massive that anything associated with him but not by him tended to disappear in the brightness of that light. Once Syreeta was a gifted artist who deserved her own spotlight. This album proves that beyond any doubt. Number 3 is where this list gets truly heartbreaking. And if you don't know this story, what you are about to hear is going to stay with you. Number 3, Minnie Riperton, Come to My Garden. 1970.
Barely touching each other.
Most perfect album you have probably never heard in full. There is a particular kind of silence that happens when you put on an album that is truly extraordinary. Your body slows down. Your mind goes quiet. You stop doing whatever you were doing and you just listen. Come to My Garden does that from the very first track. It does not sound like anything else from its era. It does not sound like anything from any era.
And I am another.
But it exists in its own world, a world that Minnie Riperton and producer Charles Stepney built from the ground up. Minnie Riperton had 5 usable octaves. That is a voice so rare that most vocal coaches will go their entire career without hearing one like it. She could move from a low, warm, almost spoken register all the way up to a whisper above high C, and every note in between was controlled, expressive, and full of feeling.
I won, and I am.
The Charles Stepney was one of the most gifted record producers in the history of black music. He worked primarily in Chicago, and his arrangements blended classical structure with jazz harmony and soul emotion in a way that nobody else was doing. Together, they made Come to My Garden for GRT Records, a small label that had none of the resources to match what they had created. The album was recorded in 1969 and released in 1970. It received almost no promotion, barely any distribution, and sold so few copies that it was deleted from the catalog and became almost impossible to find. For years, it was a ghost record, something musicians and critics who had managed to find a copy spoke about in hushed tones, like a secret. When Epic Records eventually signed Minnie Riperton in 1973 and she had her massive hit with Lovin' You, there was a brief surge of interest in her back catalog.
While we're here.
But Come to My Garden was out of print, and the Wright situation was complicated. It took years for the album to be properly reissued. By then, Minnie had been diagnosed with breast cancer. She passed away in 1979 at the age of 31 and never fully saw the world recognize what she and Charles Stepney had made together. This album was killed by its own label before it could breathe.
You can see inside me. Will you come inside me? Do you?
Small distribution, no marketing budget, a tiny pressing run. It never had a chance in the commercial market, and then the cruelty of history compounded that original injustice. The Minnie Riperton was reduced in the popular memory to Lovin' You, a beautiful song, but a tiny sliver of what she was capable of.
Will you come inside me? Do you wanna ride in?
Come to My Garden represents the full picture, and the full picture is one of the most extraordinary things ever committed to tape in the history of music, not just R&B music. We have 2 left. Number 2 is a man who had a number 1 hit and somehow let it become the thing that buried him. Number 2, Billy Paul, 360 Degrees of Billy Paul. Philadelphia, 1972, the same year as the biggest hit of his life. And somehow, the world chose one song and forgot everything else. You know Me and Mrs. Jones. Everybody knows Me and Mrs. Jones. It is one of the most recognizable R&B songs ever recorded. That opening chord, that voice, those strings, it is perfect. But here is what you might not know. The album that song lives on is even more than that one song.
To let it go now.
And Billy Paul, the man who made it, was so much more than a love song about a married woman. 360 Degrees was produced by Kenny Gamble and Leon Huff for Philadelphia International Records. That combination of producer and label in 1972 was about as powerful as it got in R&B. Gamble and Huff had invented the Philadelphia sound. Lush, orchestrated, sophisticated, deeply emotional.
6:30, and no one knows she'll be there.
And Billy Paul was one of the most musically complex voices they ever worked with. Billy Paul had come up through the jazz world. He was not a pure pop soul singer. He had harmonic intelligence and understanding of melody and chord movement that most R&B singers of his era simply did not have, and 360 Degrees gave him the room to use all of it. The album covers ground that most soul records of the time wouldn't go near. There is social commentary, there is jazz-influenced balladry, there is gospel feeling, there is sensuality. It is a complete, fully realized artistic statement. Me and Mrs. Lloyd Jones went to #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 and #1 on the R&B charts. It won a Grammy. It dominated the conversation so completely that the rest of the album simply ceased to exist in the public mind. Billy Paul had actually been recording for years before this breakthrough, building his reputation on the Philadelphia jazz scene. By the time 360 Degrees came out, he was already in his 30s, a fully formed artist who had paid his dues in every possible way. While the overnight success story was anything but overnight, he had been working toward that moment for over a decade.
I want to meet and talk with you.
The shadow of Me and Mrs. Jones is long and total. When a single becomes that dominant, it does not just overshadow the album. It replaces it in the cultural memory. People stopped thinking of Billy Paul as an album artist and started thinking of him as the Me and Mrs. Jones guy. And that reduction was a tragedy for one of the most musically sophisticated artists Philadelphia International ever produced.
To let it go now.
Go back to the beginning of 360 Degrees and listen without skipping to the hit. What you find there will genuinely surprise you. And now, #1, the greatest soul voice you have probably never heard. A man who gave everything to the music and never got what he deserved in return. #1, O.V. Wright. The album is Into Something Can't Shake Loose, 1976.
I can't shake it loose.
7 High Records, Memphis, and I need you to really hear what I am about to say. Overton Vertus Wright was one of the greatest soul singers who ever lived, and most people have never heard his name. There is a feeling that only the best gospel-soaked soul music can produce. It is not quite sadness and not quite joy. It is something in between, something that only comes from a voice that has been shaped by real faith, real suffering, and real love for the music itself. O.V. Wright's voice produces that feeling constantly. From the first second he opens his mouth on this album, you feel it. Something shifts inside you. You lean forward, you turn the volume up without thinking about it. This is not music that is trying to entertain you. This is music that is trying to reach you. Into Something was recorded at Royal Studios in Memphis with Willie Mitchell producing. At Royal Studios was the same room where Al Green made Let's Stay Together and Call Me. The same wood-paneled walls, the same baffling, the same particular acoustic warmth that Willie Mitchell had spent decades refining. But O.V. Wright brought something to that room that was entirely his own. His roots were deep in gospel music. He had sung in churches since he was a child, and that gospel foundation is present in every single note he sang on this album. The record came out in 1977, at a moment when disco had taken over the radio completely. Memphis Deep Soul had almost no commercial path left.
Wait a minute.
Into Something was not going to get played on any station that mattered, and it didn't. But what is on that record is some of the most shattering, most emotionally true, most purely human music the 1970s produced. It is grief and faith and longing and strength all living in the same voice at the same time. Disco killed this album's commercial chances before it was even released.
Here I am. Here I am.
The market had shifted so completely that there was simply nowhere for Memphis Deep Soul to land. Radio wasn't interested. Distributors weren't interested. The major labels weren't interested. And then history added one more cruel layer. O.V. Wright passed away in 1980 at the age of 41 before the world had any chance to recognize what he had done. He died largely outside the mainstream conversation, his work known only to the most dedicated collectors and musicians. He never got a Grammy. He never got a network television performance. He never got the kind of moment that lesser artists were handed without having to work for them. What he got was this album. And this album is enough to prove to anyone willing to sit with it that Overton Vertus Wright was one of the genuine greats, a man who sang like he had nothing left to lose and everything left to say. If there is one record on this entire list you need to go and find today, it is this one. Into Something Can't Shake Loose, O.V. Wright, 1977, number 1.